After 10 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and start this call. My name is Elizabeth Glidden. I'm with Minnesota Housing Partnership. And we've been working with all of you to convene a space where we can share some information about what is happening at the federal government level that may impact people and families in Minnesota and programs that we work with. And be able to also hear some feedback from all of you on what are things that we can work on together. Just a little housekeeping as we get going. You might want to mute yourselves just so that there isn't any noise disrupting others on the call. And it would be great if folks would like to introduce themselves in the chat. Maybe with your name at least, pronouns if you like, and if you have an organization or an affiliation, just so we kind of know who's here. I think that would be a nice thing. And I'm going to pull up, as folks are doing that, I'm going to pull up a presentation for the first part of our meeting. And here I go. All right. Well, as I said, this is a meeting series that MHP has started. We first announced it as a monthly meeting series because of the pace of information and activities from the federal government level, the Trump administration and Congress. We responded to requests to increase this meeting, at least in the short term, to weekly, and then we'll kind of monitor when we might reduce this frequency. This is what we're hoping to do today. First, and I think someone needs to mute themselves, or if Brian can help me identify who needs to mute, that would be great. So first, I'm going to give a little bit of some updates and may seek some calling a friend, calling a couple folks who might be able to help me out with some information where we're just trying to clarify where things are at. We do have a couple of guests that are going to be part of our meeting today, talking about what's happening as part of a legal response. We are going to welcome Oliver Larson, who's a manager with the Minnesota Attorney General's office, to talk about what's happening through their office around some couple of court cases. And then Margaret Kaplan from the Housing Justice Center is going to talk about some work that she is going to help lead with Housing Justice Center folks in helping us housers kind of understand legal framework and perhaps some next steps. And then we're going to talk a little bit about advocacy. So first, just some updates. These are topics that we have covered in all of our meetings thus far. So we're going to touch a little bit on what do we know about staffing of the various agencies that work on housing related work. We're going to talk a little bit about what we know about program and just like funding generally, and then a little bit about what's happening in Congress. So we've been reporting on these various proposed staffing cuts that have been winding their way through the federal government. Of course, there's been a lot in the news about not only what's happening with housing related staff, but other staff throughout the federal government. And this is the best information we have so far based on some reports. And I've tried to cite to those reports where we've seen some kind of reporting. Sometimes it's from an administration official, sometimes it's from someone else who says that they heard from the administration on staffing cuts. And the really most significant one we're keeping our eye on is what is happening with HUD. And as you can see from the best information we have, several of the departments or divisions within HUD will be virtually eliminated if these proposed staffing cuts move forward. So a piece of this also is what we've been hearing about what may happen with field offices around the United States, including the Minneapolis field office. There are a couple of pieces of information. One is newer this week was an article in Bloomberg that again repeated that there are some proposals to close the field offices. The leaked memo is one that was a memo issued relating to reductions in force that would impact staff within the field offices. One of the things that was reported in this Bloomberg article that I've linked above, which I was not familiar with, is apparently there is federal law that says that we are to have a HUD office in each state. So I guess that also says to me there might be some legal arguments about the offices themselves, although how well they're staffed will make a big difference as to whether they're actually operational. And I was just going to call on, I saw, talked a little bit to Ryan Baumtrog this morning and just wanted to see if Minnesota Housing's received any other information about what is happening with the Minneapolis field offices. We're just trying to kind of bridge this, how do we report information that we are receiving, but we're not forwarding rumor?
Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, everybody. Ryan from Minnesota Housing. I think your words kind of make sense. Advance. I mean, I think from everything we are hearing, it's HUD's intent to close the Minneapolis field office, but what we don't know is when and how and what that will mean in terms of everything we do at the agency, and I know others on the call do, with HUD Minneapolis on kind of day-to-day transactions, where they will go, presumably to Chicago, but with what staff, given your previous slide about reductions, planned reductions in workforce, kind of what staff will be able to kind of do the day-to-day transactions work that we do between project-based rental assistance and multifamily asset management and first mortgage products and things like that. So we're kind of anticipating that it'll happen, but when, how, and what that means for what we're going to do is completely kind of up in the air. So we will stay very close. We're thinking a lot about our great partners at HUD Minneapolis in this kind of extremely uncertain period for them, and can update as it goes along. But we're also kind of wondering when and what and how that'll impact our work with HUD.
Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate that update. Let's just kind of keep moving forward. Another piece of news that came out this week. So again, USDA is one of the entities that where there have been some proposals to reduce staff, including within the Rural Development Division of USDA, which includes rural housing services. However, there was some court action that happened. It's actually with an entity called the Merit Systems Protection Board. Essentially said that the process used to terminate the probationary employees, so these are employees that have not yet reached that status of having full civil service protections because they're considered probationary. So that process somehow was defective. And so they will need to restart that process. And there's some discussion about whether other agencies might be impacted through some sort of similar action with Merit Systems Protection Board. So just, again, a note that a lot of this is in flux, and we're trying to report on what we know about what's happening with staffing and as best we can. So just a refresher, this is some information we've been sharing the last couple of weeks. It's helpful that the Urban Institute has been sharing state by state and congressional district level information about HUD funding. HUD, just again as a refresher, is or housing at the federal government level has really been the main source of housing related resources in the United States has been driven at the federal government. And when you compare the resources that are available through the federal government compared to state level resources, our state level resources are really dwarfed by what is there at the federal government level. And this has been really very stable for many, many years. There's many of us kind of wish that the federal government had done more maybe to change, advance, increase what it's doing, but it has been very, very stable. So what's happening now with a lot of the proposals is really creating a lot of concern about how our housing markets in general will be impacted, as well as, of course, more directly how people and families will be impacted. So this is just a little way to kind of put a picture to that for the state of Minnesota. On particular funding programs, I guess I will say I don't think that there have been major changes in what we've been hearing about what's happening with funding at the federal level, although I might again kind of turn to Ryan to ensure that I'm correct. I've been hearing a lot of people just talk about many programs as they feel ghosted by the federal government. Just things aren't moving forward as you might expect, even though we haven't seen official notices of terminations or cancellations as of yet for several funding programs. And up here, I have Continuum of Care, Home, CDBG as some examples. For other, there are some particular contract areas where funding has those who are funded have received cancellation notices, or there have been bigger announcements about intentions to claw back funds. And that there I might kind of point to the Inflation Reduction Act. And we'll link to this when we send this out, but there have been some announcements in the last couple of weeks from the agency head at EPA about wanting to claw back this very large amount of money for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is being held at Citibank, and some of that would be used for green loans, including for housing related purposes. And then this Green and Resilient Retrofit Program, which is a competitive program for multifamily housing projects, doing decarbonization, energy efficiency, all sorts of things. And Common Bond was the one organization that received funding for that program in Minnesota, and as I understand, have received some kind of communication that those funds are being held or not distributed. And Ryan, am I right that this is sort of an accurate picture of kind of what we're understanding?
Elizabeth, I think that's right. One thing to note with home listed there, we are still where we have contracts. We are continuing to make draws for both home and National Housing Trust Fund. So for those where there's contracts executed and loans closed, we continue to draw and have not had issues doing that. So I don't know if that's the case for other participating jurisdictions who also receive those funds, but we continue to draw on what's available there.
So I know I see one person has their hand up. I might just ask if you would put your question in the chat. I just want to make sure we kind of get through this quickly, and then make sure we have our guest speak, and then I will turn back to questions folks have about this and make sure we're able to air those a little bit more. Just quickly going through what is happening at Congress before we turn to some guests that would talk about what's happening in the legal sphere. Again, there's this process called reconciliation that the Trump administration and Congress have all indicated that they want to use. This is a process that allows bypassing filibuster rules. So you only need a simple majority. But what has happened to date is we have one really big, massive bill that the House has passed, or not the bill, but there's a way they pass essentially kind of like a budget framework that indicates what they want to do. And the House has incorporated kind of everything they want to do into this, which includes how they would pay for extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in a large picture way. The Senate passed a different type of bill. They had a strategy that would involve two bills for this reconciliation process, but some of the indications we've heard is that the Senate is going to look to how they might be able to craft one bill to match the House. So we'll see if that happens. There's been nothing announced yet. The big thing that we're watching, of course, is that we are currently being funded at the federal government level with what's called a continuing resolution that expires on March 14th. So this is a temporary agreement for a temporary spending measure that Congress makes, where it is extending the spending levels that were agreed to in fiscal year 24. And we are now, of course, quite a ways into fiscal year 25 for the federal government. So as we understand it right now, whether you look at the budget proposal of the Senate or of the House, we are not seeing full funding of housing choice vouchers in that fiscal year 25 budget. So that is one big item of note. Although I will say kind of what we had seen from the White House had forwarded a request for what they call anomalies to fiscal year 24, where they would be able to fully cover those contracts for housing choice vouchers. So we're still waiting for what might be worked out. But again, if we do not have an agreement as of the 14th, we would have a partial government shutdown. And then this is sort of the big picture here for what we're seeing in terms of the proposals for spending once we get to fiscal year 26, where we would really have just a massive change to how we understand the federal government to operate in our lives if we see those kinds of funding changes. So I am going to stop sharing and see if we have our guests here. We had a guest from the Minnesota Attorney General's office, and just want to see if he's here.
Yes, I'm here.
All right, Mr. Larson. So again, we have Oliver Larson, who's a manager with the Minnesota Attorney General's office. And we had invited him here to talk a little bit about a couple of cases, one that the Attorney General's office is participating in that relate to funding at the federal government level.
Sure. So we've got actually a fair amount of litigation now pending, obviously, in various federal courts on various issues. But I think the one that this group's probably most interested in is the Rhode Island litigation. And then I'll also speak a little bit about a case that we're not directly involved in out of the District of Columbia that some of you are probably, most of you are probably familiar with. And that's the case that was brought by the National Council for Nonprofits. So the lawsuit in Rhode Island, we filed that really after the initial kind of OMB memo came out in February that put basically freezes across the board on a wide swath of federal funding. We were able to obtain a TRO essentially that basically the next day after filing it, and then proceeded to preliminary injunction proceedings where we, both sides made arguments to the court about what the end result should be while the case gets litigated. And I think on Wednesday, we got the preliminary injunction order from the court. So under both the pre-existing TRO and the preliminary injunction, now essentially the federal government's under a court order to continue funding. Now, what that exactly means is obviously open for debate because there's a spectrum between things that have been appropriated by Congress but not under contracts, all the way to things that where you've got existing grant agreements and a real obligation to pay under the grant agreement as well. The outer kind of perimeter of what our order looks like is subject to debate, but at least in our view, it basically prevents the federal government from engaging in any what we call categorical freezes, where they're just for policy reasons trying to shut down various funding streams that Congress has appropriated. So that's in a nutshell kind of where we are with that. I will say that lawsuit, especially it was a little unclear under the TRO how broad the TRO really was. Did it cover entities other than just the states themselves? The preliminary injunction has brought some clarity to that, and the preliminary injunction is pretty clear in saying that it applies only to funding that's being sent directly to the states. So to the extent that there are nonprofits, NGOs who have grants directly from the federal government, the Rhode Island litigation is not going to cover that. And so those groups are going to have to find, to the extent that they need to go into a litigation perspective, they're going to have to go in a different direction. And so I'll talk briefly. I see we'll have some questions, and I'll take them. There is the separate action that was brought in the District of Columbia by the National Council of Nonprofits. They also secured a TRO and then now a preliminary injunction that essentially directs the federal government to continue funding. Again, what that means is subject to some debate. The National Council of Nonprofits earlier this week filed a motion to get some clarification from the court about exactly what that means. Like, how far do you have to be in the funding stream for that order to apply? Does it apply to things where there's not actually an existing grant agreement yet? What does it apply to? And so for people who have kind of direct funding from the federal government, that's definitely something that you're going to want to pay attention to. The other thing I will just counsel people before we start opening up for questions. I mean, the next phase of this we think is probably going to be lots of terminations for convenience. We think that's probably where the federal government is going to go and essentially attacking grant agreements on a grant by grant basis. That's obviously a lot more labor intensive on both sides, which is probably why they haven't engaged in it yet. But we're starting to see some of those types of terminations for convenience. What I would say about that is the termination for convenience provisions of these contracts do give the feds some pretty strong rights to terminate grants. That said, it's not unfettered. There is what I would call a form of a termination for cause. In other words, there is guidance at the federal government level that essentially says that the federal government can't terminate a grant simply because they have a policy change. That's, the fact that, a new administration comes in and has a different perspective on the utility or wisdom of a particular program doesn't qualify as something on which they can terminate for convenience. So that's something that, again, if you're starting to see termination for convenience issues, it's something you want to pay attention to. Also know that there is essentially a right to challenge if you get one of those, but you have to bring that challenge within 30 days. So to the extent you see one of these, you're going to want to kind of get on it. And frankly, I'll just be honest, without counsel, it may be a little bit challenging to fight back against one of these terminations for convenience. The other resource that I will just kind of put on your radar, which is Lawyers for Good Governance. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but it's essentially a coalition of attorneys who are willing to do some pro bono work. They're also setting up clinics. See if I'll try and throw it into the chat here, but they're running essentially informational clinics to educate people on how to best position themselves for these kinds of terminations for convenience or other funding shortfalls. And so even if you're not in a position to retain counsel, that may be something that can assist you. And then, ultimately, I do think, from having talked to a lot of members of the bar, that there are a lot of attorneys out there who are willing to assist NGOs and nonprofits in defending against these kinds of actions. So maybe I'll open it up for questions at this point.
I saw one question from Brian Paulson. If you could just define terminate for convenience. And just so you know, this is a almost fully non-lawyer crowd.
Okay.
So
So most traditionally in the world of government contracting, and this bleeds over into grant making, the government retains what's called a right of termination for convenience, which is unusual, right? In the private sphere, you sign a contract with somebody, it's a contract, right? Both sides have to fulfill their obligations under the contract. Government contracts and government grants often include provision, typically do include provision that says that the government party can just terminate the agreement for no reason at all, for convenience. They don't have the money, or they're seeing something in the program that they don't like, or whatever it is. It gives the governmental counterparty extremely broad rights to terminate the grant agreement that would not be typical of a contract between two private parties. And so virtually all of the kind of grant agreements that we see, or government contracts that we see, have some version or flavor of termination for convenience. Now, when the government terminates for convenience, they're still obligated. There's a process for it that they have to follow. They also have to pay the grantee or the contract vendor for the work that's performed through the date of the termination, which is usually prospective. It's not something where they can just say you're terminated as of today. It's usually like a 30-day provision or something like that. And they have to pay you essentially for the work that's completed through the date of termination. But it's an unusual, it's a provision that would surprise people who do not operate in this sphere.
maybe I'll just note, I don't know that we want to go deep on this right now, but we just one of our partners from LISC is on this call, and LISC is one of the organizations that had a contract with the federal government that was terminated supposedly for violation of the executive order on DEI. So I don't know if you saw anything about that, Oliver, but we have, and there's at least one other organization in Minnesota that have received money as part of that kind of same set of grant agreements, having them canceled supposedly for violating the executive order on DEI.
So what I can say about that is none of these contracts, at least I've not seen any contracts that would basically say something like the government can terminate on the basis of a DEI issue or something like that. So the extent that there are, the federal government has definitely they put out executive orders, say basically go forth and terminate all of your contracts to the maximum extent permitted by the law that have these kinds of DEI or other elements that they don't like. And it's not just DEI, it's gender issues, immigration issues, all of their hobby horses. The reality is that those are probably, if they get litigated, those are probably terminations for convenience, because there really isn't going to be a provision in law or in statute that allows the government to simply say, we're going to terminate this because it's for DEI work. They will make arguments, I suppose, that the contracts were illegal from the start because they've got various views of some of the affirmative action decisions that have come out of the Supreme Court that they think apply to these. I think that's not a good reading of the case law, but one way or the other, I think where that litigation is going to head is into termination for convenience. So they may say that they're terminating you for DEI, but what's really happening at the legal level, if they have to litigate it, it's going to be a termination for convenience.
Yeah, and another one here, Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid had a contract.
We see, I see I see the chat. I mean, we're seeing letters like this that are, coming out from all different parts of the federal government that say things like this, or they tell people, stop work while we're looking at this, or, there's just all kinds of extra legal things that are happening right now with the federal government telling people that either the government can do things that they can't do, or that people should not spend money that they're, entitled to spend and seek reimbursement on. And I understand that that's a very difficult position for these organizations, right? If you've got to lay out funds and seek reimbursement, not knowing if you're actually going to get reimbursed. That's, a very difficult proposition. And I think, quite frankly, that's exactly what the federal government is trying to do, is create the uncertainty, knowing that, just the uncertainty of reimbursement may be enough to essentially shut down a lot of these programs, because the grant recipients don't have the ability to essentially front the expenses without knowing that they're going to get reimbursed. So we see lots of letters like this across the board. When they target, the state gets them too, right? There's letters exactly like this that have gone to, whether it's the Department of Agriculture or MPCA or Department of Commerce. And we're probably better positioned to push back, because we've got lawyers like on staff who can, and we're part of a multi-state coalition. So we're taking things like this, and through the Rhode Island lawsuit, we basically take that first to the lawyers for the federal government, and then if necessary to the court, and say, hey, they got to restore this funding. And we've been successful with that. So I will say is, if you fight back, you've got good arguments, but I mean, obviously that requires having, counsel and maybe an open lawsuit and all of these things that are really taking you away from your core missions and put resource strains on what you can do.
Well, thank you so very much, Oliver. We really appreciate you spending time with us, giving us this overview. And I know you mentioned a couple of resources. I don't know if you have any time to pop any of those into the chat, or
Yeah, I will put the one that I think, the one that is probably most relevant to this group would be the Lawyers for Good Government. So I will, I'll put a link in the chat to, they've got an intake form on the internet for signing up for some of these clinics, and so I will put that into the chat here.
Thank you so very much. Well, we're going to turn then to Margaret Kaplan from Housing Justice Center. Margaret, you ready to go?
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. Margaret Kaplan. I'm the president of the Housing Justice Center. I use she, her pronouns. I think I've met a lot of people in this group. And just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the sort of things that we are thinking about and hearing about in the legal and regulatory space as it applies to organizations here in Minnesota, and as it fits into kind of context of other work that's happening around the country. I'll also say that we have a lot more questions than answers at this particular point in time, I think, as we all do, right? As people are trying to respond in real time to things that either are happening or they think might happen. And so one of the things I'm just going to throw out there is that we do, and I know it was included in one of the last emails that Elizabeth had sent around. We do have a meeting planned for next week for people who want to go a little bit more deeper into the weeds of what's happening and discuss a little bit more of what some of these legal and regulatory things are happening around the country, what we can be doing about it, right? I'm going to start off with a couple very, very high level things. The first is, and this has become one of my standards caveats in almost every discussion I have, and that is encouraging organizations to look really carefully at the information that they keep, right? And making sure that you have really good policies about document retention and document destruction, and that as you're keeping and gathering information, to make sure you have an eye towards protecting the people in the communities that you work with. I think one of the challenges for a lot of organizations, especially as we think about some of the issues that we're hearing about and some of the executive orders coming out, is wanting to make sure that on the one hand, we're fulfilling our obligations as organizations under our contracts and under our grant agreements, and at the same time, really thinking about the privacy of information and data for the clients and communities that we serve. The second is that I know that sometimes when you're hearing about executive orders and when you're hearing about executive actions that are coming out from the current administration, it can be a little bit like drinking from a fire hose, right? Because there are the things they're actually doing, and then there are things that they are indicating they might be doing. One really good resource for folks who want to just have a little bit more information about current legal cases in response to some of the executive actions is there is an entity called Just Security. It's justsecurity.org, has a really good litigation tracker. And what it's doing is it's gathering information and compiling it about all of the current cases that have been filed around the country based on some of these administration executive orders. And so, and they keep it very well updated. And also they encourage people to send them information about cases that they know are coming. And much of it, like I said, is tied to some of those specific executive orders that are coming out or specific executive actions that are occurring. So you get kind of the latest and greatest, and they also keep it updated with kind of anything that is happening within those cases as well too. So it's a good way to sort of stay really grounded in what's happening. So one of the things that I'll say is that we're still, in many ways, like everybody else, trying to wrap our heads around what are the most effective things that we can be doing as an organization, and also what are the ways that we can be sort of reaching out to and catalyzing support both here within Minnesota, within our legal community, and also coordinating with other folks around the country. And one of the first things that's really important for us to understand as we're trying to evaluate what cases might be most effective in response to what people in Minnesota are feeling is to really get very precise and high quality information from people, from organizations that are being affected by some of these actions so that we can evaluate, well, what is the cause of action? What is the case? What are we looking for? And how can we sort of make some of the individual things that people are feeling in their organizations and in the communities they're working with into something that is a cognizable case? The other thing is that not everything that's happening and not every potential cause of action that exists for folks in Minnesota necessarily makes sense to be a case that's filed in Minnesota, right? Because where you file a case is critically important because every court is going to be a little bit different. And so we're coordinating with other people around the country to make sure that not only are these the best cases to be pursuing at this particular point in time, but that also they're being brought through the system in the places where they're going to have the best chance of success as well too. So some of them may be appropriate for Minnesota, and some of them may make a whole lot more sense being filed someplace else around the country because other organizations are experiencing very similar things to what people in Minnesota are experiencing as you see some of the impacts of these executive actions, contract cancellations, and things like that. The other thing is, well, we're, I think, as a community, right, trying to react to what has happened. We also want to anticipate and develop our best arguments for what we think is likely to happen. In other words, it is best for us to be prepared well in advance to anticipate some of the harms that are happening within communities so that we can begin developing out what the response is before the action takes place, right? And some of that is really understanding, once again, how is this impacting organizations, their operations, their ability to serve the communities that they're trying to serve? I would say a really good example of this is we're hearing a lot about the challenges associated with permanent supportive housing and the support services that are necessary in order for those properties to effectively house people and for it to be affordable and for people to continue to have the wraparound services that are necessary. Some of that is responding to things that have already happened, but a lot of it is also, a little bit speculative, right? What happens if? And so we want to understand from people what that looks like and what those specific issues are. The other thing is there are a number of different types of cases that I think it's important for us to be considering and thinking about as a community. And that is, there are the cases that are about things that are not being funded or funding that is being blocked. There are things about the reasons for that. And then there are also, and I was really struck by, the contract cancellation for fair housing, which we had heard is happening around the country. What are the things that HUD is no longer doing that are some of their responsibilities? And how do we, as sort of a housing community, make sure that that work of asserting people's right to fair housing isn't being compromised, even as HUD is no longer appearing to be in the fair housing business, right? Because the laws are still the laws. And even as we're seeing things through some of the proposed rules that may change the interpretation of that, there are some fundamental concepts in fair housing that just kind of mean what they mean if HUD isn't enforcing it. And if they're blocking off the funding to organizations around the country who are able to enforce it, how do we make sure that we do not collectively lose the thread that people still have a right to housing access free from discriminatory barriers, right? Fair housing is a thing. That law hasn't changed. A couple of things that are happening right now that I think are important for people to, that I just want to tell people about, because I think it's good as we think about like, how do we respond in this moment? The first is that we are trying to really work to connect with people who are in some of the pro bono departments in some of the different law firms that we work with, also working with folks in the bar, in the access to justice, to try and make sure that we're bringing more people into these spaces, right? Because this is not something that any one organization does alone, nor, I mean, there are a lot of things that I think are really strong legal cases that aren't, for example, they're not a housing justice center case, but they're a really important case. They're going to affect housing, and we need to make sure that there are the people who are able to do that work. The second is that we have been coordinating with some of the national organizations that are working on filing cases around the country and making sure that we are sharing information and that we're connecting the dots with folks. A lot of that is quite slow moving. And so just wanting to kind of let people know that sometimes it is, so much of the work of bringing together a legal case is the stuff that you don't see. It's getting prepped so that you make sure that the case that you bring is the best possible case in the best possible venue with the best possible chance of success without delaying things too much. I see Elizabeth went off mute, so I just want to make sure I'm not over talking.
Yeah, you might be just kind of wrap up in a couple minutes. I don't want to cut you off, Margaret.
Sure. Well, I think I will probably kind of pause it soon, because for folks who want to sort of get a little bit more into the weeds, to talk a little bit more specifically about what maybe some of those potential cases could be here in Minnesota, and talk about the ways that we can coordinate together. We do have a meeting on the calendar for next week. I really encourage people who are like, yeah, like there are real things happening to us right now, or there are things we are anticipating happening, and we want to figure out how those tie with what other people are experiencing, so that we're thinking about this not in terms of the harm to an individual organization, but what are some of the more collective actions that can be taken. So we know that there's a lot happening with individual organizations right now, and people are trying to sort of triage what's happening to them in this moment. The strongest cases are going to be the ones that are really impacting more of a sort of systemic approach. What is happening to you is happening to other organizations, is happening to other people around the country, and that becomes sort of the basis for some of the challenges that we're looking at exploring right now. This work is all very much in its infancy in some ways, but it builds on, I think, a long history of organizations in the legal community challenging government actions when those actions are causing real harm, especially in the context of the arbitrary nature of some of the changes that are happening and the way it's impacting existing really important rights that we have all sort of relied on historically in making sure that there is stability in our housing system, because uncertainty harms people. It harms individual families. It harms organizations. It harms the very ability to provide affordable housing opportunities and do the kind of sustained, supported development that we need in order to make sure the lowest income households have the greatest chance of safe, stable, affordable, accessible, dignified housing in the community of their choice, free from discriminatory barriers.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I really appreciate you took the time to kind of give us a bit of that overview of things to start thinking of. And I just want to make sure we have a little bit of time left here to talk about next steps that we're hoping people are going to engage in. I also just want to call out, I saw some chatter in the chat about earmarks, and that will also, I'm going to call on folks there as I kind of show one slide with some resources. Just a second here. Play from current slide. Okay, so just to kind of follow up on what Margaret was saying, I've already had some folks in the chat and also emailing me with a desire to attend this meeting. So please, if you would like to attend, Housing Justice Center is going to facilitate this discussion and future ones that we might have on legal issues. This group might be the one that morphs into talking more about policy issues, but I think we're going to sort of feel it out, so to speak, as I understand. And I know Housing Justice Center is also offered to help with leadership around policy and regulatory conversations. And then I just want to thank, there was a group of about 10 folks who met this week to talk about comms and public mobilization. They gave some input on some updated messaging that we're going to be sharing with you about this day of action, March 10th, and have talked about working on a letter to the editor. And so just wanted to call that out and say thank you so much to those folks. So just turning to some of the action steps that are moving forward, the National Low Income Housing Coalition is working with many other national organizations on a sign-on letter. As of now, I know there are over 500 organizations nationwide who have signed that letter. They are still trying to kind of increase the number who have signed on, and we would really appreciate if in Minnesota you would add your organization to this list if you feel that that's appropriate for you, because this is what helps Minnesota members of Congress understand that this is important to Minnesota organizations, and is sort of a request for them also to be paying attention and engaging in this conversation. There's an individual action alert where you can just push a button to send a letter to your member of Congress. And then we have put together some resources, which I'm going to share with you, that will help with more individual contacts, whether it's through a phone call or whether it's through a meeting where you might have a little bit more time and are able to share a story. This is where you have the greatest impact, is being able to do some of that story share, what's happening on the ground, or what, if something happened, would be an impact, or what is the impact of a delay. These are the things where we are understanding from others who have had meetings with Minnesota members of Congress that they really want to focus on what are stories of things that are happening now, and that may include what is happening because funding is delayed, or there is uncertainty about whether funding will be coming that has been expected. So just thinking in that realm. I know some people also say, hey, I think my member of Congress doesn't like these cuts. Well, whether they're Republicans, whether they're Democrats, all of these members of Congress in Minnesota need our attention. We've put together this shared resources Google folder. And right after this, I'll put it in the chat too. But it has a call script, and I'll share that call script with you. It has a sample meeting agenda. It has all sorts of materials that really help you more with a meeting with a member of Congress. It has a sample meeting request, staff contacts, and this is where I want to get to the earmarks. It also has a list of all earmarks that are managed by HUD for each member of Congress in Minnesota. So what we have heard from some of our national folks is that, including particularly for Republicans, that this is a way that we can connect this to things that they have directed to happen, that they have requested to happen, that may be impacted by reduced funding, including reduced funding in the field offices. So, and then finally, we have this message because March 10th is what we are calling a day of action. And this is where we hope that folks will be actively making calls using the call script we're providing, or reaching out to schedule meetings with your members of Congress. Now, I think it was Paul, did you have a message in there or a question about earmarks? Little exchange with Scarlett. I just wonder if one of you could say a little something for the full group about kind of what you have been, it sounds like both of you are working on projects that are essentially earmarks, congressionally directed spending. And what have you understood about that?
So we're constructing in the Longfellow neighborhood a shelter, 54-bed shelter and 48 units of housing. Everything else is together for that. We received from Hennepin County an earmark from Tina Smith's office, and $750,000, and we absolutely need to know if we're actually getting it as soon as we can. And we've already engaged with Tina Smith's office, so basically that's the thing, is we're trying to find out if it's actually going to come. If it doesn't come, what our options are. Yeah.
Thank you.
And it's approved from last year. Hennepin County is also looking into it since it's going to them first anyway. So, and they've been helpful.
Thanks for that update. Scarlett, did you have one that you were working on?
Thanks, Elizabeth. We're actually going to be reapplying for a project in Deer River, Minnesota. For those of you that don't know, Deer River is a community of about 900 people in greater Minnesota in the Arrowhead type of region. And last year we were not selected, and this year we're going to go for it again. However, with all of these changes, it's drastically impacting how we have to restructure the project. That's everything from funding to some of the voucher units and looking at who's impacted. We did have some I don't want to say partnership, but some help from the tribe for NAHASDA funds. And, with trying to figure out if that's going to be in place, if some of these HCV or PBVs are still going to be in place, how it's going to impact our COC, who has been an amazing advocate for us, and then also how we're going to still fill some of the gaps. So it is really hitting us hard here in Greater Minnesota.
And just one last thing I'll just say about this earmark process is I have just received an update. It is actually from our partners at the National Rural Housing Coalition that members of Congress have been putting out their individual processes by which you can request an earmark in the fiscal year 26 budget. So I'll just say that's kind of interesting. They are putting that out there. They're moving forward with that process. I will put some of those resources into this Google folder that relate to Minnesota members of Congress if I have that in sort of a better, easily accessible place. But that is, again, how you would make a request and get the attention of your member of Congress. Just to kind of share that. This is in the folder. I just got a suggestion too from someone on this call, Linda Soderstrom, about putting another resource into the folder that helps you think about, this is more like a bit of a canned message. It's to make it easy for you to leave a message with your member of Congress. Do these matter? Yes, they do matter. Every office is sitting there counting contacts that they receive on issues. And if they don't get calls on housing, it's like it's a non-issue to them. So we do know this is not the most impactful thing that you can do. Is it impactful? Yes, it is impactful. And for you to share with others, this is a way that they can, we can make an impact by making sure that offices are hearing, and this is to make it easier for you to be able to get that call done. Margaret, I'm going to call you. Just one more thing. Linda had suggested that we include some tips on how you might tell your story. It's a document that's been called Testimony Tips, but you can use that to guide how you might in a setting where you have a meeting with your member of Congress, or have an opportunity to share something that is, again, more that personal story, how you think through crafting that. Margaret?
I was just going to add that contacting your members of Congress is so essential, because really what it comes down to is they're the ones who are going to be passing that next budget, right? They are going to be the ones who decide, is there money in the pots? Even if, the administration is gumming up the works in terms of getting the money to you, they also need to appropriate those dollars. And many of the programs that we depend on for the long-term affordability and sustainability are subject to congressional appropriations. Every long-term contract for permanent, project-based rental assistance is subject to appropriations on some level. And so making those calls, developing that relationship, making yourself inevitable in this process is going to be critical, because you're going to need those relationships in the future if we're all going to kind of get through this without losing so much affordability.
Thanks for that last comment. I think on that note, we have hit 11 o'clock. I want to release everyone. We will be sending out this information to you, and really appreciate your partnership on this call. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.